Earlier this week, I posted a poll over on our YouTube community asking you all what you thought was the best options for a new class coming to the Elder Scrolls Online in the future. Y'all gave me tons of amazing ideas there that I want to discuss more in depth, and this is actually a great topic for a video. So here I want to look at the top 7 class ideas that are still missing from the Elder Scrolls Online. Any of these ideas could easily fit into the game right now to make a complete, fully fleshed out new class, but I do think some are more likely than others based on popularity and existing resources, as well as a few other factors which I'll discuss. But again, this is just my opinion. If there's anything I missed, feel free to sound off in the comments section below, and let's jump right into it. Starting with number 7, we have the warrior or fighter type class. Now this is pretty common, pretty consistent in all fantasy MMOs, so it's a bit surprising that it has never made a true appearance in the Elder Scrolls Online as a playable class, especially since it is such a popular choice in other fantasy-based RPGs and MMOs. The warrior is one of the most straightforward archetypes in RPGs, including the Elder Scrolls series, which I think is why it's appealing for so many players. I mean, warriors focus on being direct, specializing in melee combat. Their reliance on physical damage and brute strength means they don't have to worry about, complicated mechanics, and you can just get right into the heat of battle, making this a great choice for beginners. Now, in terms of the Elder Scrolls Online, warriors would be an obvious choice for players that want to specialize as a tank. This class would have naturally higher defensive stats, maybe more base armor or a higher health pool based on class passives, plus the ability to gain enemies' attention with some type of class-based taunt, as well as crowd control abilities like knockdowns. The warrior archetype is also a classic in terms of DPS builds, as this could easily, specialize into melee weapons or perhaps bleed damage, with further options for flurry-based attacks or Berserker's Rage style abilities, and so on. I think the only missing piece of this class, in terms of the sort of classic warrior archetype, as far as ESO goes, is the ability to specialize into healing, but that could easily be worked into the class toolkit by focusing on a more shamanistic side, including maybe totems, chants, war cries, and so on. One way this could also be leveraged in ESO is similar to how the Arcanist class was built to focus on a specific Daedric prince, like Hermaeus Mora for the more scholarly focused Arcanist, but in this case build the warrior around a more brutal, combat-oriented Daedric prince like Boethia. Boethia, the Daedric prince of treachery and survival of the fittest, embodies that strength, that sort of martial prowess. They eventually led to the creation of Malakath and the Orcs. Plus, Boethia is a major figure in Elder Scrolls lore that hasn't really appeared too much in ESO as of yet. But this is definitely one of my favorite playstyles, so much so that I tried to build my own barbarian-style warrior build, which uses 0 class skills, only 2-handed weapon abilities, and some utility options in there as well. This build was recently updated to be even more powerful with the addition of the new 2-handed scribing skill called Smash, along with some additional healing from Wield Soul, which finally makes this build feel like a pure brawler, or basically completely unique from any other class build in the game. I'll have a link for that down in the description if you want to check that one out. Next up, we have a class which actually made a brief appearance in early ESO development, so there's a definite possibility that we could still see this one again sometime in the future, and that is the Battlemage class. Now, the Battlemage has a long history in Elder Scrolls titles, going back to previous class systems for games like Oblivion and Morrowind, where the Battlemage was an actual class you could choose from during character creation, just like the other class archetypes which ESO eventually took on, like the Sorcerer class and the Nightblade class, which again, those date back to those older Elder Scrolls games. But during the ESO beta, the Battlemage was actually planned to be the 6th playable class, along with the Warden class, but the Battlemage was scrapped, as was the Warden, back at launch in favor of those 4 standard classes of the Templar, the Sorcerer, the Nightblade, and the Dragon Knight, though as we know, obviously the Warden class returned later to the game as the 5th class. But some remnants of the Battlemage class still exist within the game, including class icons for the Battlemage. But Destruction, 2-handed, Alteration, and Mysticism were some skill lines associated with the class back then, when those familiar schools of magic were still being used in the game. Eventually, though, parts of this concept were later adapted into like the Necromancer and the Arcanist classes, Both are kind of more like Battlemage-y play styles, which specialize, in necromancy and eldritch magic respectively. But I think there is still some room for this classic archetype in ESO. For example, there are many Battlemage type NPCs in the Elder Scrolls Online, particularly members of the Worm Cult, so that's another possible angle we could see in the future. Maybe if we ever see a return of Manny Marco in the story, though I do think it would be challenging to incorporate this class at this later stage in the game's development, because generally speaking, most builds can already function as a quote-unquote battle mage and, wield magic and weapons at the same time. Plus, most magic types, including ice, shock, and fire, are also represented in other class types currently, like the Sorcerer, the Dragon Knight, and the Warden, so a Battle Mage class would need to be able to harness something new, I think, in order to stand out from the crowd. Now, one option in that regard is a focus on storm magic, which we see a lot in Elder Scrolls lore when it comes to Sea Elves, or the Meomer, as they're also called. Now, if you played through the Aldmeri Dominion storyline in ESO, then you're already, familiar with this race as being a non-playable race right now that could actually be really interesting if they also added the Meomer as a playable race along with the Battle Mage as a playable class. I think you could see a nice synergy there with a future content or DLC release. But this class could have plenty of options, in terms of fitting into the three primary roles of ESO of tanking, healing, and DPS. The lore and the world building is already there, as we discussed, and it is a class that's already been at least designed in theory, so it could come back to the game in the future at any time, much like the Warden class eventually did. But let me know what you think of the likelihood of a Battle Mage class down in the comments section below. Next is one of my favorite choices for the next class in ESO, and one that I think has a lot of potential, and that is the Monk class. Now, I thought we would have already seen a Monk by now in ESO for several reasons, but the main one is that there are lots of powerful Monk NPCs and even bosses in the game currently, and that seems like an easier option to bring in a new class when there are so many existing abilities and even animations already in the game's files, which could be either, repurposed or updated to bring a new playable Monk class to life. We've seen ESO take this approach with two of its previous class designs, that being the Warden and the Necromancer class, where those NPCs already existed in the game, and some of those animations and concepts were then reused to make the playable class to, basically give the developers a head start. And I think that's a big strength of the Monk class design when it comes to ESO. Now, my favorite of those existing Monk NPCs, as I said, is a boss known as Pyroturge. He's the main boss of the Black Drake Villa DLC dungeon, an amazing boss fight, by the way, which extends into multiple areas, so you should definitely play this dungeon if you have not already. But this NPC really showcases everything that I think a monk could be in the Elder Scrolls Online if it were fully fleshed out as a playable class in the game. Not just pure melee abilities, but also a mix of spirit and magic, which I think is a lot more interesting. So obviously the Pyroturge boss that I mentioned has the basic moveset down in terms of kicks and palm strikes and so on. So we know that those basic animations are already in the game. We can see this even in several other unarmed NPCs as well. Like, I believe there are some Khajiit monk type NPCs in the Elsewhere zones, which also have this moveset, and a few other enemies around the game as well. But with this boss specifically, I really like how he also weaves in this elemental abilities like waves of fire and fire tornadoes, creature summons, and even summoned weapons. Now, I don't think fire would be the right element for a monk class, as we already have the Dragon Knight class in ESO, which essentially specializes in fire. But again, like the Battle Mage idea previously, the monk could weave in some magic types which we haven't seen extensively yet in ESO, like wind magic, tornadoes and maybe even water, including whirlpools, tidal waves, and so on. So elements like that, earth, wind, water, I think could really fit well with this archetype or class. Now, another concept that I liked with the Pyroturge boss was that in his later stages, he actually summons a weapon as well, which I think is like a flaming sword from what I remember. Now, I don't think that necessarily fits with the monk aesthetic here, but the idea of monks being able to summon maybe some temporary weapons as part of a martial arts master skill line, perhaps, I think that's a pretty cool idea, like maybe a melee staff, for example. This would actually help the developers around the problem of having to implement entirely new weapon art and styles into the game if they just gave, a few new, let's call them spirit weapons to the monk class for some of their abilities. I mean, think of how certain Templar abilities look like a spear, or certain Nightblade skills look like a bow or a dagger. The monk could have similar effects for certain skills in their toolkit. But like I said, I think a mix of some new elemental magic types with those unarmed attacks, which, like we said, already have animations, with the possibility for some unique spirit weapons, would really flesh out this class idea and make it truly unique. A monk obviously would focus on mental strength and speed more than brute force, so this could really mix things up when it came to creating a monk tank or a monk DPS build, for example. And then in terms of healing, maybe sharing their essence with other players would be how a monk heals in this game. I'm not really sure. But I think just like the warrior/fighter archetype, a monk is something that's very popular right now in most fantasy RPGs and MMOs, and it's something that we've already seen with existing NPCs in ESO, so it could easily fit right into the game and be a great choice for players moving forward. Next up is a wildcard idea, but I have seen it mentioned quite a few times as a potential fan favorite. Plus, there are some existing NPCs in ESO with this same archetype, just like we saw previously with the monk. But this time we're talking about something a lot more unique, and that is an Alchemist class. Now, I tried going back to previous titles to see if there was anything even close to an Alchemist class in previous games, and there really wasn't anything very similar to this at all. So I think it would be sort of a first for an Elder Scrolls title, at least in terms of a playable class. Now, obviously the alchemy skill is already in the game as a general crafting skill, but the Alchemist as a class would be unique and take things to the next level, using potions and other crafted items maybe for combat, whether to deal damage, tank enemies more effectively, or support their group. Now, interestingly, there are several types of alchemist or chemist enemies in the Elder Scrolls Online currently, so this isn't a foreign concept by any means. I mean, in several zones and dungeons, for example, you can come across these basic chemist-style enemies who, throw exploding potions, which do AoE fire or maybe poison damage, for example. Healing potions obviously is a no-brainer, as well as the Alchemist class could expand on healing and buff potions both for themselves and for groups. One of the most interesting Alchemist NPCs is actually the focus of an entire dungeon expansion in the Elder Scrolls Online that's called Stone Garden, which is run by the mad alchemist Arceus. Now, there's a great story here accompanied by some great dungeon design, which I won't spoil, but basically you can find hidden potions throughout which grant you special bonuses and also transform you into a werewolf behemoth. So I think the idea behind this class could be that some potions not only buff you and your group, but could also lead to transformations. I mean, think about transforming enemies into a rat or a sheep, or basically some more docile form that lowers their health or their attack power. Then you could have other transformation buffs that turn you or your group members into some type of Hulk or behemoth-style creature, which, gives more defense or more damage potential and so on. So I think, the consuming potions along with throwables, and then with the potential for transformations, there is some really unique possibilities here to fill an entire class kit, and it's something I think would definitely work well if it was done right. But that idea could potentially go hand in hand with our next class idea, which is the Dwemer Artificer or a Dwemer Engineer. Now, to be clear with this idea, I am not talking about playing as a Dwemer, because that's probably never going to happen in an Elder Scrolls game, but instead this class would function as a researcher or a specialist in Dwemer technology, similar to how the Arcanist class specializes in Hermaeus Mora and Eldritch magic. So instead of summoning runes of power like the Arcanist does, imagine the Dwemer Artificer or an Engineer class would enter combat by summoning Dwemer constructs like the Dwarven Spheres, Robotic Spiders, Dwemer Sentries, or Centurions. So in terms of style or theme, it's basically like a summoner class, again with a focus on Dwemer technology, which is a really unique and Elder Scrolls themed take on the classic summoner idea, which I think would be extremely popular with a lot of players. Now, in terms of lore, we know that characters like this already exist, and we've, met them in several quests and side missions in ESO. You have Kirith and Raynor, as well as Tellinger, the Artificer from the Mages Guild, so there's already a precedent of having this style of character in the game, but I think making it a playable class would take things to a much higher level and allow for so much more creativity, both for players in terms of creating builds, but also for the developers. I mean, just think about as a tank possibly donning some Dwemer construct armor or summoning clockwork shield or weapon. As a DPS, you could imagine summoning those spiders or spheres into combat that I mentioned earlier. And as a healer, I think, damage shields and regeneration might be a specialty there. But overall, this class would function as sort of a mix of between Necromancer summons with some of that Arcanist utility thrown in. So I think that, again, this would be a really popular and powerful option with the possibility of some very unique visuals and class themes built into the kit. This is basically as unique Elder Scrolls as you can get, with the exception of the Arcanist, of course. So if the developers really wanted to build something unique that stood out from the class archetypes in other games, this would definitely be the way to go. And I'm 100% sure that this would be insanely popular, but of course, this is just my opinion, so feel free to let me know what you think down in the comments section. But that brings us down to the final two classes on this list, and I saved them for last, actually, because I think they are the two classes we are most likely to see next in ESO. First up is one of my favorites on this list because I think it's a very traditional MMO class that ESO could really benefit from. It fits the lore and the timing is perfect, and that is the Bard class. And I've played the Bard in many other MMOs, and it's always been a lot of fun to play, but also very unique. In the past, it's functioned as sort of a support or hybrid character, which could be interesting, if it were to get added into ESO, because in terms of group roles, that's not something that's specifically outlined for group content like dungeons, for example. I mean, typically you have, one tank, one healer, 2 DPS, and that's your group dungeon loadout. But what could be really interesting in the future is if ESO also released a few new dungeons which were more difficult, maybe enough to require, 5 players. And if they did that, then maybe they could add a new support specification or support role to, group mechanics for things like more magicka sustain, more crowd control, movement and mobility. These are all things that bards typically specialize in, while in other games as well. But of course, you could just stick with, the typical holy trinity of tank, healer, and DPS roles, which we've always had. And I think a bard could fit well in those roles as well, with the right skills, obviously. Now, this would be pretty interesting with ESO's style of action combat. I think a bard would play very different from ESO's other classes right now. Typically, skills in ESO don't have cooldowns, but if the same were true for a bard in ESO, where you could have maybe 8 to 10 different songs all playing at once with no cooldown, that would probably be very powerful and complex. So they might need to tweak how bards work compared to other classes in ESO in terms of balance, right? So I'm not really sure how this would work, to be honest, but that's one of the exciting things about, classes in the Elder Scrolls Online and how you could make a bard class work. I mean, one option would be to make certain songs be toggled on or toggled off. We've had plenty of toggled skills in the game before. Another option would be to have song limits or instrument limits, like maybe you can only have one song toggled on for each type of different instrument that the bard has access to. So you can have one song active for the lute and one for percussion and one for voice and so on. Then of course you can mix in spammable abilities, weapon skills, and this has a lot of potential to be great if the devs were willing to mix things up a bit and really take a new approach to combat and class design to make the bard, again, unique compared to other ESO classes, because the way it feels and the way it plays, I think, should be different. So as I said, I think the bard is more likely than other classes because, like I said, it is a very popular class idea. I know it's highly requested right now by the ESO player base, but also just in terms of timing, I really do feel like we will be going back to Skyrim soon in terms of ESO expansions. And the Bard's College is, of course, in Skyrim, so it's a great opportunity to bring this class to the front if that's something that the developers want to do in the future. But that also ties into my number one missing class in ESO that I think has the best potential of coming to the game next, and that is a Dragonborn or Greybeard style of class. Now, to be clear, this isn't my favorite option on this list. I think the Bard and a few others that I mentioned are going to be better in terms of gameplay, but if we're talking strictly in terms of selling expansions and potential profit for ZeniMax Online, then I think something based on the Dragonborn is definitely the class with the most marketing potential, which, I mean, like it or not, this has to be one of the main considerations that ZOS looks at when determining the next class coming to the Elder Scrolls Online. Now, I was recently watching a video by my friend Jake Clips who brought this to my attention, so full credit to him on the timeline here, but what he discussed in that video was that 2026, basically 2 years from now, is going to be a big year for the Elder Scrolls franchise, as that's going to mark the 15-year anniversary of the release of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. And as we know, based on past experience, ESO loves to cash in on that nostalgia factor. And I think that year coming up would be a perfect time to expand on the current Skyrim regions in ESO. And then just imagine, as part of that release, a new class also came out where now you can play again as the Dragonborn. Again, yes, I know it's been done to death before in Skyrim, but for those players who haven't taken the leap into ESO, coming from Skyrim, that actually might be a huge selling point for them to fully get involved in ESO for the first time. And for a bit more context here, I think it's important to note that Skyrim is still the most popular Elder Scrolls game by far, even though it's like 13 years old at this point. I mean, just look at these Steam chart numbers with over 30K concurrent players, which is very good for a single player game that old. Just compare this to its concurrent player count for ESO, which is less than half that number. I mean, don't you think that ESO wants to get some more of those Skyrim players over to its more current and updated version of the Elder Scrolls universe? Of course they do. And the 15-year anniversary is going to be their next big chance at doing that in 2026. And of course, new classes tend to do that best, as we know from past experience as well. Going back to that poll that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video, this was the most popular option that I could fit in the poll. So yeah, there's definitely some interest here. And if they haven't already considered it, I'm pretty sure ZOS is looking at this for a potential class, or even just a potential skill line to get added to the game at some point in the future. I mean, the skill design for the most part is already there if you're going back to look at Skyrim. We know there's something like 30 skills or shouts that were released in Skyrim when you consider DLC content, with many interesting effects that we haven't really seen yet in ESO, like causing your enemies to give up and run away, throwing your voice to fool and distract enemies, pushing enemies away from you, summoning, weather effects and cyclones, commanding animals, speeding up weapon attacks, and there's just many more shouts in Skyrim. There's just a lot of options that a class like this could do in ESO, while still being fun to play and fitting into its current systems. Like I said, I don't think it's the most exciting option, but I do think it's the most likely right now, especially with that Skyrim anniversary coming up and the timing of it all. We know that generally it's taken, 3-ish years to finish a new class, and by 2026, that'll be about 3 years since the Alchemist, and it will line up perfectly with the Skyrim 15-year anniversary. So that's it. Those are my picks for the top 7 missing classes in the Elder Scrolls Online right now. This is just my personal opinion. So now I would love to see what you all think about this. When do you think ESO's next class will arrive, and what do you think it'll be? Let us know down in the comment section below. Don't forget to check out that updated Barbarian build, which I mentioned previously, which we designed in such a way that it actually does feel like a completely new class. That's available right now for our Tier 2 channel members, right here on YouTube, along with dozens of other members-only builds and guides that we make just for you for supporting the channel. More information on that can be found by clicking on that join button down below, or the members link in the description. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for making this channel possible. I could not do what I do without you. Thanks to all of you, of course, for watching this video. And as always, I hope you're doing well. Stay safe out there, and I will see you around in the next video.